The lights in the Medical Academy's meeting chamber flickered with an anxious purple hue, reflecting the mood of its occupants. Dean Root, with his bark-like skin and branch-like appendages, stood before the assembled faculty of Station Epsilon 7's Galactic Medical Academy. His leaves rustled with obvious concern as he made the announcement. "Our new first aid instructor will arrive in 2 standard hours," he said, his translator converting the rustling into clear speech. And yes, the rumors are true. They are human. The chamber erupted in worried whispers. Professor Glow's bioluminescent spots flashed rapidly in distress, while Dr. Drift's gaseous form swirled in agitation. The concept of having a Deathworlder teach at their prestigious academy seemed to disturb them all. But Dean, Professor Glow's lights pulsed urgently. Humans are known for their aggressive healing methods. They physically attack injured bodies. They compress thoracic cavities. They pierce flesh with metal needles. How can we expose our students to such violence? The Dean raised a wooden limb for silence. The Galactic Medical Council has determined that human first aid techniques, while appearing harsh, have shown remarkable effectiveness in emergency situations. We must adapt, or we risk falling behind other medical institutions. As the faculty continued their worried discussions, a small transport ship docked at the station. Ray Smith checked his environmental suit one last time before stepping out into the station's adjusted atmosphere. He carried a simple med kit, its contents carefully approved by station security after much debate and several horrified gasps. The human walked through the station's corridors, noting how other beings moved away, their various biological warning systems activating at the sight of a Deathworlder. Ray had expected this. Earth's high gravity, extreme temperature variations, and dangerous fauna had shaped humans into what the galaxy called Deathworlders, beings capable of surviving conditions that would kill most other species. At the Academy's entrance, a small welcoming committee waited. Dean Root stood with 2 other faculty members, all maintaining what they considered a safe distance. Ray smiled behind his transparent faceplate, wondering how they would react to the concept of the recovery physician. "Welcome to Station Epsilon 7's Galactic Medical Academy," the Dean's translator conveyed. "We trust your journey was comfortable." "Very comfortable, thank you," Ray replied, deliberately keeping his movements slow and gentle. "I'm looking forward to sharing Earth's first aid techniques with your students." The crystalline being to the Dean's left chimed anxiously. "About that, we've reviewed your proposed curriculum. Surely there must be less invasive methods." Ray held up his medkit. "I understand your concerns, but sometimes saving a life requires direct action. Let me demonstrate with this training dummy." The faculty members watched in horror as Ray opened his kit and pulled out a simple bandage. The gaseous professor quickly floated backward, their form condensing in shock. "This is just the beginning," Ray explained, wrapping the bandage around the dummy's arm. "Wait until we get to the CPR section." The Dean's leaves trembled, but he stood his ground. Perhaps we should start with theory first." "Yes, definitely theory. The students will need time to adjust to these concepts." Ray nodded, having dealt with similar reactions on other stations. "Of course, I've prepared detailed explanations for each technique. Understanding the why often helps with accepting the how." They led him to his new classroom, a spacious chamber with seats designed to accommodate various alien physiologies. The walls displayed holographic anatomical diagrams of different species, though Ray noticed Earth specimens were conspicuously absent. He would have to fix that. As he set up his teaching materials, Ray could hear the worried conversations in the corridor. Words like aggressive, dangerous, and violent floated through the air, accompanied by various biological expressions of concern: flashing lights, rustling leaves, and swirling gases. Tomorrow, his first class would arrive. 20 students from across the galaxy, each with their own unique biology and healing traditions. None of them had ever encountered human first aid techniques before. Ray smiled again, remembering his own instructor's words. Sometimes, The best medicine looks like madness to those who don't understand it. He placed the CPR dummy carefully on the demonstration table, knowing its presence alone would probably cause quite a stir. This was going to be an interesting semester, teaching beings from gentle worlds that sometimes saving a life required what they saw as violence. But by the end, they would understand. They always did, especially after the first real emergency. The classroom filled slowly as students drifted, floated, and shuffled in. Ray watched from behind his desk as they chose their seats, noticing how they all picked spots as far from him as possible. Their translators created a mix of nervous chatter in standard galactic common. A floating blue sphere, who would later introduce himself as Blue, hovered near the back row. His surface rippled with mathematical patterns, a sign of deep analysis among his species. Next to him, a beam made of pure light, called Spark, flickered anxiously. In the corner, a misty form that looked like morning fog condensed into a vaguely humanoid shape. This was Mist, who seemed to be trying very hard to appear as small as possible. "Good morning, class," Ray said, standing up slowly to avoid startling them. "I'm Professor Smith, your new first aid instructor. Today, we'll start with basic emergency response principles." He walked to the front of the room, and several students wobbled in their seats. A plant-based being's leaves curled inward defensively. Ray had expected this reaction. It was the same at every new teaching post. "The first rule of first aid is to ensure the scene is safe," he began, activating the holoprojector. "Can anyone tell me what they would do if they found an injured person?" Blue's surface rippled faster. "Send calming thought waves from a safe distance of 10 meters. Secrete healing enzymes into the air," Spark suggested, their light dimming slightly in uncertainty. Mist condensed enough to speak. "Generate a protective mist barrier and wait for professional help." Ray nodded patiently. "Those are all interesting approaches, but what if the injured person is in immediate danger? What if they're not breathing?" "Not breathing." Spark flashed in alarm. "But that would mean death." "Yes," Ray confirmed, "which is why sometimes we need to take direct action. Let me show you something basic, the recovery position." He walked to the training dummy lying on the floor. As he knelt beside it, several students drifted backward. Blue's surface showed warning patterns, but he remained in place, watching intently. "When someone is unconscious but breathing, we need to keep their airway clear," Ray explained. He demonstrated rolling the dummy onto its side, adjusting its arms and legs into the proper position. A high-pitched keening sound filled the room as a crystalline student vibrated in distress. You touched it. You moved its body." "Yes," Ray said calmly. "Sometimes we must physically move people to save their lives. Now, who would like to try?" The silence in the room was absolute. Even the ambient sounds of various biological processes seemed to quiet down. Finally, Blue drifted forward, his surface showing patterns of both fear and curiosity. I will attempt this procedure," he said, hovering near the dummy. Ray smiled encouragingly. "Excellent. Don't worry, it's just a training dummy. It can't be hurt." Blue extended a small tendril of his liquid form and barely touched the dummy's shoulder. The entire class held their breath, or whatever passed for breathing among their species. With Ray's gentle guidance, Blue managed to roll the dummy onto its side. "Very good," Ray praised. "You've potentially just saved someone's life." Blue's surface showed patterns of surprise and satisfaction. Spark's light brightened with interest, and even Mist drifted a little closer to see. "But this is just the beginning," Ray continued. "There will be times when we need to act even more directly. For instance, if someone's heart stops beating." "Stops beating," Spark interrupted, their light fluctuating wildly. "You mean to say you know when to let nature take its course?" "Yes." Ray shook his head. "No. We fight death, sometimes quite literally." He reached for the CPR dummy on another table. The class watched in growing horror as he explained chest compressions. Spark's light dimmed until they were barely visible, Three gaseous students merged into a worried cloud in the corner. Blue's surface showed complex mathematical equations that seemed to be calculating the force required and the damage it might cause. "This is barbaric," someone shouted from the back. "No," Ray said firmly. "This is survival. And by the end of this course, you'll understand why sometimes the greatest kindness can look like violence, and the gentlest healer must have the courage to act decisively." He looked around the room, meeting each student's sensory organs directly. "Tomorrow, we'll practice these techniques. I suggest you all prepare yourselves mentally, because in emergency medicine, hesitation costs lives, and I intend to make lifesavers out of every one of you." The class ended with a mixture of terrified and fascinated murmurs. As the students left, Ray noticed Blue lingering behind, his surface still rippling with calculations. Perhaps, Ray thought, this was how change began, with one student brave enough to question their assumptions. The next day's class started with nervous energy filling the room. Ray had placed the CPR dummy front and center, its plastic chest exposed and ready for demonstration. Blue hovered closer to the front today, his liquid surface showing patterns of intense concentration. Spark had positioned themselves behind a crystalline student, using them as a partial shield, while mist had spread out into a thin fog near the ceiling. "Today," Ray announced, "we learn how to restart a heart." A collective shudder passed through the classroom. Several plant-based students entangled their leaves together for comfort. "But first, let me explain why we do this," Ray continued, activating a holographic display of a human heart. "When a heart stops beating, every second counts. Brain damage begins within minutes. Death follows shortly after. In many cases, we can prevent this through CPR." Blue's surface rippled with a question. "Professor, our research indicates that most species consider the cessation of life functions to be final. Are you suggesting humans regularly defy death?" "In a way, yes," Ray smiled. "We refuse to accept death until we've tried everything possible to prevent it. Now, watch carefully." He knelt beside the dummy and placed his hands on its chest. The class leaned forward despite their fear, morbidly fascinated. Ray began the compressions, counting out loud. The sound of plastic compressing filled the room, along with several gasps of horror. "The force required is significant," he explained while continuing compressions. "You must compress the chest at least 2 inches deep, at a rate of 100 to 120 compressions per minute." Spark's light flickered erratically. But that would break ribs." "Sometimes, yes," Ray admitted. "Broken ribs are better than death." That was too much for Spark. Their light dimmed completely, and they dropped to the floor with a soft tinking sound, having fainted from shock. 2 gaseous students quickly surrounded their fallen classmate, trying to revive them with gentle energy transfers. "Is anyone else feeling faint?" Ray asked, pausing his demonstration. "It's okay if you need to step out. This is challenging material." Blue drifted even closer, his surface now displaying complex medical calculations. "Professor, I have been analyzing the force distribution. It appears surprisingly precise. This is not random violence, but calculated intervention." "Exactly." Ray beamed at his student's insight. "Every aspect of CPR is carefully designed. The depth of compressions, the rate, the position of the hands. It's all based on extensive research." Spark had recovered and floated shakily back to their spot, their light still dim, but now tinged with embarrassment. "But surely there must be gentler ways." "Sometimes gentleness fails," Ray said softly. "Sometimes life requires decisive action. Now, who would like to try?" The silence stretched for a long moment. Then, to everyone's surprise, Blue moved forward. "I will attempt this procedure," he announced, his surface showing both fear and determination. "My species can form solid appendages when needed. I believe I can generate sufficient force." Ray guided Blue into position. The liquid being formed 2 solid hands, similar in shape to human ones, and placed them on the dummy's chest. With Ray's coaching, Blue began compressions. Excellent form. Ray encouraged. You're hitting the perfect depth and speed. Other students watched in fascination as their classmate performed what they had moments ago considered an act of violence. Blue's surface showed intense concentration, but also something else. Understanding. I comprehend now, Blue said between compressions. The force is not random. It mimics the heart's natural function. We are not attacking the body. We are helping it remember how to live. Ray nodded proudly. That's exactly right. Sometimes, helping requires action that looks forceful to outside observers. But everything we do has a purpose. By the end of class, 3 other students had worked up the courage to try compressions. Even Spark had drifted closer to watch, their light showing cautious interest rather than pure fear. Next class, Ray announced as they packed up, we'll learn rescue breathing. You mean we have to touch their air holes? Someone squeaked from the back. With proper barriers, yes, Ray confirmed. And it's called mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. The horror on their faces almost made him laugh, but he kept his expression serious. They would understand eventually. They always did. As the students filed out, he noticed Blue lingering again, this time accompanied by a hesitant Spark. Perhaps, Ray thought, the tide was beginning to turn. Understanding was replacing fear, one student at a time. The Academy's practice lab buzzed with nervous energy as students gathered around various first aid stations. Ray had set up different scenarios at each station: bandaging, splinting, wound cleaning, and the dreaded CPR practice area. The room's environmental controls worked overtime to handle the stress emissions from 20 anxious alien students. Today is all about hands-on practice, Ray announced, holding up a roll of bandages. We'll start with something simple: bandaging wounds. Mist, who had been quietly observing from the back in previous classes, drifted forward with unexpected interest. Their foggy form concentrated into a more solid shape as they examined the bandages. These are just fabric strips, Mist observed, their voice like a whisper of wind. No biological healing agents. No energy infusion. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective, Ray explained. The bandage keeps the wound clean and supports natural healing. He demonstrated on a dummy arm, wrapping it with practiced ease. The students watched, less fearful than before, but still uncertain. When Ray asked for volunteers, Mist surprised everyone by being the first to come forward. I believe my form may be advantageous for this task, they said, condensing their misty appendages into more defined shapes. To everyone's amazement, Mist's foggy tendrils handled the bandages with remarkable precision. They wrapped the practice dummy's arm perfectly, their gaseous form allowing them to achieve the ideal tension from all angles simultaneously. Outstanding, Ray praised. You have a natural talent for this. Mist's form rippled with what seemed to be pride. Other students began to move forward, encouraged by their classmates' success. Blue approached the splinting station, his liquid surface showing determination. Spark, still cautious after their fainting episode, chose the wound cleaning station. The room filled with activity. The crystalline student struggled with bandages that kept slipping off their sharp edges. 2 plant-based learners tangled their leaves in the splint materials. A gaseous being accidentally absorbed 3 bandages before figuring out how to manipulate them properly. Remember, Ray called out, moving between stations, adapt the techniques to work with your natural abilities. The goal is to help the patient, not to copy human methods exactly. Blue had figured out how to solidify parts of himself to hold splints in place, while keeping other parts liquid for fine adjustments. Spark discovered they could sterilize wounds instantly with carefully controlled light bursts. Each student began finding ways to make the human techniques work with their unique physiologies. Then came the first minor accident. A crystalline student scraped their surface against a rough edge of the practice table, creating a small crack. The class froze, waiting to see how their human teacher would handle a real injury. Ray calmly approached, first aid kit in hand. "May I?" he asked, showing respect by requesting permission to help. The crystalline being chimed nervously but nodded. With gentle movements that surprised everyone, Ray cleaned the area and applied a special bonding agent he'd prepared for crystalline physiologies. He then wrapped a flexible bandage around the crack, providing support while the bonding agent dried. Sometimes, he explained to the watching class, first aid isn't about dramatic interventions. It's about knowing what to do and staying calm while doing it. The crystalline student chimed in agreement, examining the bandaged area with interest. It doesn't hurt anymore, they announced, their voice ringing with surprise. The class continued, now with renewed enthusiasm. Mist went from station to station, mastering different bandaging techniques. Blue methodically worked through each scenario, his surface displaying increasingly complex medical calculations. Even Spark had grown confident enough to practice CPR, their light pulsing in rhythm with the compressions. As the session ended, Ray noticed something significant. The students were no longer maintaining their previous safe distance from him. They clustered around as he gave final tips, their fear forgotten in their enthusiasm to learn. The recreational area of Station Epsilon 7 usually hummed with peaceful activity. Various species mingled in the carefully maintained artificial garden, designed to accommodate beings of all environmental needs. Today, that peace was shattered by the sound of screeching metal. Ray was walking with Blue, Spark, and Mist, discussing their progress in the first aid course, when the gravity generators flickered. The sudden shift sent several beings tumbling. A support beam, weakened by recent maintenance work, groaned and snapped. "Everyone move," Ray shouted, his voice cutting through the panic. His students watched in amazement as their usually calm instructor sprinted toward the danger instead of away from it. The beam had struck a crystalline tourist, creating multiple fractures across their surface. A plant-based being lay tangled in fallen vegetation, their leaves turning brown at the edges. 3 gaseous beings had been compressed by the gravity fluctuation, their forms dangerously unstable. Blue's surface rippled with emergency patterns. "Professor, what do we do?" "What we trained for," Ray called back, already kneeling beside the crystalline being. "Blue, you handle Trage. Spark, we need light for the plant being. Mist, find my emergency kit in the classroom." To their own surprise, the students moved without hesitation. Blue's surface displayed assessment patterns as he quickly categorized the injuries. Spark floated to the plant being, adjusting their light spectrum to provide emergency photosynthetic support. Mist returned at incredible speed, their foggy form condensed tight around Ray's first aid kit. They quickly spread out, using their gaseous form to deliver supplies wherever needed. "The crystalline one is critical," Blue announced, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Multiple fracture lines approaching their core." Ray nodded, already pulling out the special bonding agent. "Spark, after you stabilize the plant being, I need your light to cure this agent quickly." Other medical staff arrived, but stopped short at the scene before them. The feared human Deathworlder and his alien students were working in perfect harmony. Blue had formed himself into a supportive cradle around the crystalline being, holding their fragments in perfect alignment while Ray applied the bonding agent. Spark pulsed their light in precise, healing frequencies, while Mist's tendrils bandaged injuries with extraordinary speed and precision. The compressed gaseous beings need expansion support, Ray called out to the arriving medical team. "We're stabilizing the immediate life threats." A group of senior medical officers watched in astonishment as the students handled the crisis. Gone was their fear of violent human methods. Blue shifted his form to support different patients without hesitation. Spark overcame their earlier fainting spell to provide critical light therapy. Mist moved between patients with growing confidence, their bandaging skills proving invaluable. The crystalline being chimed weakly, but steadily as their fractures sealed under Spark's carefully modulated light. The plant being's leaves began to green again, their vital signs stabilizing. The compressed gaseous beings gradually re-expanded within the containment field Blue had created. More students from Ray's class arrived, drawn by the emergency calls. Without prompting, They joined their classmates, applying their recently learned skills. A crystalline student helped stabilize their injured kin. A gaseous learner assisted the compressed beings with expansion techniques. "This is not possible," one of the senior medical officers whispered. "They're using physical intervention techniques, and they're working." Ray smiled as he supervised his students' work. Sometimes the best medicine looks like chaos to outside observers. But there's method in it, and results you can't argue with. The emergency response teams finally arrived with their specialized equipment, but much of the critical work had already been done. They found patients stabilized, injuries treated, and a group of first aid students who had... The Academy's main hall buzzed with excitement as beings from all over Station Epsilon 7 gathered for the emergency response review meeting. Ray sat with his students in the front row, watching as medical officials and station administrators filed in. The crystalline tourist they had saved sat nearby, their restored surface gleaming under the lights. Dean Root stood at the podium, his leaves gently swaying with nervous energy. "We are here to discuss the recent incident in the recreational area and the unexpected response from our first aid students." Blue hovered steadily, his surface displaying calm confidence now, quite different from his initial fear patterns weeks ago. Spark glowed with steady light, no longer hiding behind others. Mist had condensed into a clear, focused form instead of trying to spread thin and invisible. The meeting concluded with a series of chimes, rustles, and flashes of light, the equivalent of applause from various species. As they left the hall, Ray overheard two medical officials discussing the installation of CPR practice stations in every medical center on the station. 3 months after the recreational area incident, Station Epsilon 7's main lecture hall was filled to capacity. Ray stood at the entrance, watching as nearly 100 new students settled into their seats. The room had been specially modified to accommodate twice the usual class size, with beings from dozens of different species attending. Blue, now wearing the badge of a teaching assistant, hovered near the front row. His surface displayed welcoming patterns to help calm the nervous new students. Spark, also sporting a teaching assistant badge, provided perfectly modulated light levels throughout the room. Mist, the third teaching assistant, moved efficiently between students, helping them find comfortable positions for their various physiologies. "Welcome to Advanced Emergency Response," Ray began, his voice carrying clearly through the translators. "I see we have students from 15 different stations today." A crystalline being near the front chimed softly. "We heard about how your students saved lives using hybrid techniques. Our medical council insisted we learn these methods." Ray smiled, remembering his first class and how far they'd come. "Before we begin, I'd like to show you something." He activated the holoscreen, displaying footage from the recreational area incident. The new students watched in amazement as their teaching assistants demonstrated their skills during the crisis. 3 months ago, Ray continued, Blue here was afraid to touch a practice dummy. Now he can stabilize multiple fractures simultaneously. Blue's surface rippled with pride as he demonstrated, forming perfect support structures with his liquid form. Spark once fainted at the thought of CPR. Today, they can perform emergency light therapy while assisting with compressions. Spark pulsed brightly, showing the precise control they had developed over their luminous form. And Mist, who tried to hide in the ceiling during our first class, has revolutionized bandaging techniques across 3 sectors. Mist swirled proudly, their foggy form demonstrating their now famous multi-angle bandaging method. The new students murmured with interest. Their translators created a mix of excited chimes, rustles, and electromagnetic pulses. Even those who had arrived with obvious anxiety were showing signs of curiosity. "But the most important thing we learned," Ray said, gesturing to his teaching assistants, "wasn't about techniques. It was about understanding that different species can work together, combining their unique abilities with new methods to save lives." He walked to the center of the room, holding up a simple bandage. "This term, we'll learn everything from basic bandaging to emergency teleportation field stabilization. You'll discover how your natural abilities can enhance these techniques in ways I haven't even thought of yet." A plant-based student raised a leafy appendage. But what about the physical contact? The aggressive methods. Blue floated forward, his surface showing educational patterns. What appears aggressive is actually precise. Watch. He demonstrated a chest compression on a practice dummy, his liquid form displaying the exact mathematical calculations as he worked. Spark joined in, their light pulsing steadily. I once thought these methods were violent. Now I understand they're about acting decisively to preserve life. Mist condensed into a more visible form. Each of us found ways to adapt these techniques. Your natural abilities aren't obstacles. They're advantages waiting to be discovered. Ray watched proudly as his former students now helped teach others. The fear that had once filled his classroom had been replaced by enthusiasm and curiosity. On the walls, screens displayed live feeds from other medical academies across the galaxy, their students watching and learning remotely. Today, Ray announced, we start a new chapter in emergency response training. You're not just learning human first aid. You're helping create something new, something that combines the best of all our species. He looked around the room, meeting the sensory organs of each student. Some still showed signs of nervousness, but there was also determination, curiosity, and hope. Remember, he concluded, in an emergency, it doesn't matter what methods look like. What matters is saving lives. And by the time you finish this course, you'll be ready to do exactly that. The room filled with various forms of approval, flashing lights, swirling gases, rustling leaves, and chiming crystals. As Ray began the first lesson, he caught sight of Dean Root watching from the doorway, his leaves swaying with satisfaction. The change they had started was spreading across the galaxy, one classroom at a time. Soon, the term Deathworlder First Aid would be replaced by something new, unified emergency response, a combination of techniques from all species working together to preserve life in all its forms.